November 19th, 1943. 327 B-17 flying fortresses cross into German airspace at 24,000 feet, their contrails scribing white lines across the frozen sky. Inside the lead aircraft of the 91st Bomb Group, Bombardier Lieutenant James McLean hunches over his Norden bomb site, watching the city of Bremen materialize through scattered clouds. 4 minutes to target. The intercom crackles with pilot confirmations as 300 bomb bays open in mechanical unison. McLean's hands rest on polished brass knobs, making microscopic adjustments to account for wind drift and ground speed. The Norden represents America's most classified technology, a $15,000 mechanical computer guaranteed by its manufacturers to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. But McLean knows different mathematics. His squadron has flown 17 missions against German industrial targets. Their average hit rate hovers near 4%. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 23 bombs dropped for every one that strikes within 500 feet of the aiming point. Today's primary target, the Focke-Wulf aircraft assembly plant, sprawls across 6 city blocks of reinforced concrete and steel. Intelligence estimates require direct hits on at least 12 critical workshops to achieve meaningful production disruption. At 4% accuracy, that means 300 aircraft dropping over 3,000 bombs to guarantee mission success. The formation thunders overhead at 210 miles per hour. German flak batteries erupt in black flower bursts that rock the heavy bombers like boats in a storm. McLean ignores the percussion, rattling his aircraft's aluminum skin, and focuses on the Norden's eyepiece, where the target crawls into the crosshairs with agonizing slowness. His right thumb hovers above the bomb release trigger. The moment arrives with mechanical precision. Bombs away. 12 500-pound general-purpose bombs tumble from the bay, their fins stabilizing as they accelerate toward terminal velocity. McLean watches them fall for 3 seconds before German fighters tear into the formation, and his attention shifts to survival rather than accuracy. 6 hours later, reconnaissance photographs reveal the bombing results with brutal honesty. The Focke-Wulf plant remains operational. 87 bombs struck the factory complex. 11 achieved direct hits on significant structures. The other 76 created expensive craters in surrounding neighborhoods where German workers had lived until this morning. Mission analysts calculate actual factory production disruption at approximately 14%. Cost: 16 B-17 seconds shot down, 160 American airmen dead or captured, and $3 million in aircraft and ordnance expended. For the 8th time this month, mission planners confront identical mathematics. American strategic bombing doctrine promised to destroy Germany's war industry through precision daylight attacks against critical industrial nodes. But precision remained theoretical fantasy. Bombs scattered across target areas with patterns that defied every prediction made by the Norden's engineers. Something fundamental about high-altitude bombing simply didn't work the way the training manuals insisted it should. Colonel Curtis LeMay sat in his 8th Air Force office at Bassingbourn on a grey December morning in 1943, studying damage assessment photographs that represented 2 years of escalating failure. The images documented industrial targets across Germany, ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, synthetic fuel plants in Luna, submarine pens in Bremen. Each photograph showed the same maddening pattern: bomb craters surrounding intact facilities like ripples, around stones dropped in a pond. His cigarette burned forgotten between nicotine-stained fingers as he calculated numbers that wouldn't add up no matter how many times he ran the equations. The 8th Air Force had dropped 74,000 tons of high-explosive ordnance on German industrial targets since August 1942. Intelligence analysts estimated cumulative production disruption at 17% across all targeted sectors. 17% after 16 months of sustained operations that had cost 2,000 heavy bombers and 20,000 trained aircrew. The mathematics suggested that destroying German war production would require 5 years of bombing at current effectiveness rates, which meant the war would be over before strategic bombardment achieved its primary objective. LeMay's promotion to command the 3rd Bomb Division carried expectations of improving results through better tactics and tighter formations. But tactical refinements couldn't overcome fundamental physics problems that made accurate bombing from 5 miles up essentially impossible. The Norden bombsight assumed stable atmospheric conditions, consistent aircraft altitude and airspeed, and minimal defensive interference. Combat reality provided none of these assumptions. German anti-aircraft batteries forced constant altitude variations and evasive maneuvering during bomb runs. Jet stream winds at operational altitude created horizontal velocities exceeding 100 miles per hour that bombardiers struggled to calculate using mechanical instruments. Fighter attacks during the bombing phase disrupted formation integrity and forced early bomb releases that scattered ordnance across countryside miles from intended targets. And underneath these tactical complications lurked a more fundamental problem that nobody wanted to acknowledge. The Norden bombsight might simply be wrong about basic bombing physics. Major Thomas Donovan appeared in LeMay's doorway, carrying a worn leather briefcase stuffed with technical papers and trajectory calculations. Donovan's background combined mechanical engineering training from MIT with 2 years of operational experience as a lead bombardier. His analytical mind approached bombing accuracy like an engineering problem that demanded systematic diagnosis rather than incremental tactical adjustments. "General, I've been analyzing the Frankfurt mission photographs," Donovan began, spreading reconnaissance images across LeMay's desk. "The bomb pattern shows a consistent offset to the northwest, approximately 800 feet from the target center." His pencil traced the crater distribution, demonstrating how explosions clustered in a predictable pattern that suggested systematic error rather than random dispersion. Every formation's bombs fell along this same vector, indicating that something in our bombing procedure creates reproducible inaccuracy. LeMay stubbed out his cigarette and leaned forward, recognizing immediately that Donovan's observations identified something more significant than simple wind drift corrections. Systematic errors could be diagnosed and corrected. Random scatter required completely different solutions. "The Norden compensates for aircraft ground speed and wind drift," Donovan continued, "but it assumes bombs fall in perfect vertical trajectories." His hand gestured downward in a straight line. In reality, bombs retain the forward velocity of the releasing aircraft. They travel nearly 4 miles horizontally during the 45-second fall time from bombing altitude. LeMay's combat experience immediately grasped the implications. If bombs maintained forward momentum, then releasing directly over a target would guarantee that ordnance impacted 8,000 feet downrange. The Norden's engineers had designed their precision instrument based on physics assumptions that bore no relationship to actual bomb trajectories. "I've calculated the ballistic coefficient for standard 500-pound general-purpose bombs," Donovan explained, pulling typed pages from his briefcase covered with slide rule computations. "Accounting for air resistance, bomb shape, and release velocity, actual impact points fall 7,800 feet beyond the point where the Norden indicates release. Our bombardiers are dropping early by design because the site's calculations ignore horizontal momentum." The analysis explained 2 years of scattered bombing with elegant mathematical precision. Every bombardier in the 8th Air Force had been trained to trust the Norden's calculations without question. They'd been taught that the mechanical computer's trajectory predictions represented scientific certainty. But the bombsight's fundamental physics were simply incorrect, and no amount of tactical refinement could overcome errors built into the instrument's design assumptions. "So we've been missing targets by 1.5 miles because our $12,000 computer doesn't understand basic physics," LeMay observed, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone calculating institutional failures. Donovan nodded slowly, understanding that his diagnosis suggested something more troubling than mechanical malfunction. The Norden bombsight represented the technological foundation of American strategic bombing doctrine. Admitting its fundamental inadequacy meant acknowledging that the entire precision bombing campaign had been built on scientific fantasy. "But there's a solution," Donovan continued, his voice carrying cautious optimism. "If we know the systematic offset, we can compensate by releasing early. Instead of dropping when the target appears in the crosshairs, bombardiers release when the crosshairs show a point 7,800 feet before the target. The bomb's forward momentum carries them to the actual aiming point." The concept was simultaneously elegant and profoundly disturbing. Donovan was suggesting that accurate bombing required deliberately ignoring the Norden's release indicators and instead dropping ordnance based on mathematical calculations that contradicted the instrument's fundamental design. It was like using a compass by reading south when the needle pointed north. Every instinct developed through thousands of training hours would scream that the procedure was wrong. "What if you're miscalculated?" LeMay asked, voicing the question that would occur to every mission commander. "If your ballistic coefficient is off by even 10%, we'll be dropping bombs into empty countryside miles from the target." Donovan pulled additional pages from his briefcase, showing trajectory calculations cross-referenced with actual mission photographs. "I've correlated bomb patterns from 17 missions against 6 different target types. The offset remains consistent within 3% across all conditions. The physics are reliable, general. What's unreliable is trusting the Norden to do calculations its designers never programmed it to handle." LeMay stood and walked to his office window, watching ground crews service B-17 seconds that would carry another mission against German industry tomorrow morning. Each aircraft represented America's industrial capacity mobilized for total war. Each crew embodied months of training designed to operate the Norden bombsight with religious faith in its mechanical infallibility. Changing that doctrine meant retraining every bombardier in the 8th Air Force to ignore their most expensive instrument and instead rely on slide rule calculations performed during combat conditions. The institutional resistance would be extraordinary, but the alternative was continuing to scatter bombs across Germany while factories continued production and American air crews died for bombing runs that achieved nothing except expensive pyrotechnics. "I want you to run a test mission," LeMay decided, turning back to Donovan. "Take a single squadron against a target where we can get good reconnaissance photographs. Use your offset calculations and see if the bombs actually land where you predict." Donovan's expression showed relief mixed with apprehension. Testing his theory required convincing a squadron of combat veterans to deliberately contradict their Norden training during an actual bombing run over defended German territory. If his calculations proved wrong, he'd be responsible for wasted ordnance and potentially missed opportunities against critical targets. The test mission departed Bassingbourn on December 8, 1943, 12 B-17 seconds from the 381st Bomb Group, flying in tight formation toward the synthetic rubber plant at Hules. Major Donovan occupied the lead bombardier position, his hands resting on the Norden controls, while his mind calculated trajectory offsets that contradicted everything the machine's dials indicated. At 23,000 feet, the formation crossed into German airspace. Anti-aircraft batteries erupted with their characteristic black bursts, but today's route avoided the heaviest flak concentrations. The target materialized through scattered clouds, a sprawling industrial complex covering 80 acres of the Ruhr Valley. Donovan hunched over his bomb sight, watching the rubber plant crawl toward the crosshairs with familiar slowness. His calculations indicated the bombs needed release when the site showed a point 7,600 feet short of the factory center. The actual target would appear to be approaching, but not yet reached when he triggered the drop. Every instinct developed through 43 combat missions screamed that he was releasing too early. His thumb hovered over the release mechanism. Norden's indicators showed the plant still approaching. Standard procedure demanded waiting another 20 seconds until the crosshairs centered perfectly on the factory buildings. But Donovan's slide rule calculations insisted that waiting meant bombs impacting nearly 2 miles beyond the target. He pressed the release trigger. Bombs away. 144 500-pound bombs tumbled from the formation, their fins stabilizing as they accelerated through freezing air toward the rubber plant below. Donovan watched them fall, calculating trajectory in his mind while German flak continued to rock the formation. The bombs disappeared into haze, their impact invisible from 5 miles above the target. The formation turned for home, and Donovan spent the return flight wondering if he'd just wasted 12 aircraft worth of ordnance by trusting mathematics over mechanical instruments. The reconnaissance photographs arrived 18 hours later. Intelligence analysts spread the damage assessment imagery across LeMay's conference table, with expressions that suggested they'd witnessed something unprecedented. The bombing pattern showed concentration that defied 2 years of operational experience. 137 bombs impacted within the factory perimeter, 41 achieved direct hits on critical production buildings. The synthetic rubber plant's estimated production capacity had been reduced by 78% in a single mission. Hit rate calculated at 95.8% compared to the 8th Air Force average of 4.2%. LeMay studied the photographs with the intensity of someone recognizing that institutional knowledge had just been overturned by evidence that couldn't be dismissed. The bomb craters clustered around the target center in patterns that looked like training manual illustrations rather than operational reality. Colonel Harrison, give me mission parameters for destroying this target using standard bombing procedures, LeMay directed his operations officer. Harrison consulted his tactical planning tables, running calculations that had governed 8th Air Force operations since the bombing campaign began. Standard doctrine requires 7 full bomb group missions to achieve equivalent damage. Sir. That's approximately 250 aircraft, 3,000 bombs, and acceptable losses of 15 to 20 bombers per mission. The mathematics revealed strategic bombing's fundamental crisis with brutal clarity. One squadron using Donovan's offset method had achieved in a single mission what would require 7 full-scale operations under standard procedures. The efficiency improvement wasn't marginal. It represented an order of magnitude breakthrough that could transform the entire bombing campaign's effectiveness. But that efficiency came with profound institutional implications. Acknowledging that offset bombing worked meant admitting that 2 years of strategic operations had been conducted using fundamentally flawed procedures. It meant retraining every bombardier to distrust the Norden bomb site that represented America's most sophisticated military technology. It meant explaining to the American public why previous missions had achieved so little, despite extraordinary costs in lives and equipment. Get me General Arnold on the scrambler line, LeMay told his communications officer. The commanding general of the Army Air Forces needed to understand that strategic bombing doctrine required complete reconstruction based on physics rather than wishful thinking about mechanical precision instruments. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Arnold listened without interrupting while LeMay described Donovan's test results and their implications for future operations. The silence that followed suggested the general was calculating political consequences as well as tactical advantages. Curtis, we've sold the American people on precision daylight bombing, Arnold finally responded, his voice carrying through the encrypted radio connection with unusual weariness. We've told them the Norden bomb site represents technological supremacy that will win the war through surgical strikes against German industry. Now you're telling me that our most expensive military technology has been wrong about basic physics for 2 years. The institutional admission would be devastating, LeMay acknowledged. But continuing current procedures means extending the bombing campaign by years while achieving marginal results. Donovan's method works, General. The photographs prove it beyond any reasonable doubt. More silence while Arnold calculated consequences. All right. Implement the new procedures immediately throughout all bombardment groups, he decided. But Curtis, we don't announce that we've been doing it wrong for 2 years. We describe this as a tactical refinement, an improvement in technique rather than correction of fundamental errors. The American people don't need to know their tax dollars built a bomb site that couldn't hit targets. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The directive went out on December 15, 1943. All lead bombardiers in the 8th Air Force would attend mandatory retraining sessions to learn offset bombing procedures. The official explanation described the technique as a tactical enhancement that improved accuracy under combat conditions. Training bulletins carefully avoided acknowledging that the new method required deliberately ignoring Norden release indicators that had governed bombing operations since America entered the war. Resistance emerged immediately from bombardiers who'd internalized Norden doctrine through hundreds of training hours. Major Robert Patterson, a lead bombardier with the 94th Bomb Group, voiced concerns that echoed through every squadron briefing room across England. You're telling us to drop early based on pencil and paper calculations, instead of trusting a $15,000 precision instrument? That contradicts everything we learned in bombardier school. The mechanical computer doesn't factor. In bomb momentum physics, Training officer Lieutenant Colonel Marcus explained, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone who'd repeated this explanation dozens of times. The Norden assumes vertical trajectories. Reality involves parabolic flight paths that require compensation through early release. But the Norden's engineers are some of the best physicists in America, Patterson countered. Are you suggesting they didn't understand basic trajectory mechanics? The question hung in the briefing room like smoke from burning aircraft. Admitting that America's elite engineers had designed a bombing instrument based on incorrect physics assumptions suggested institutional failures that nobody wanted to acknowledge openly. What matters is results, Marcus responded, deflecting rather than directly answering. The test missions show 90+% hit rates using offset methods. Standard Norden procedures average 4%. You can trust the mathematics, or you can keep missing targets. The argument resonated because combat crews understood failure's costs intimately. Every pilot had watched bombers go down in flames during missions that achieved nothing except scattered craters across German countryside. Every aircrew had friends who died for bombing runs that left factories untouched. If offset bombing actually worked, the proof existed in reconnaissance photographs, rather than theoretical debates about mechanical instrument design. Training sessions focused on practical implementation rather than theoretical physics. Bombardiers learned to calculate trajectory offsets using slide rules and pre-computed tables that correlated altitude, airspeed, and bomb type with required release points. The procedure added approximately 45 seconds to pre-mission preparation time, but eliminated the need to trust Norden calculations that had proven systematically incorrect. Lieutenant James Warner, a 23-year-old bombardier from Pennsylvania, articulated the psychological adjustment that the new technique demanded. It feels wrong releasing when you can still see empty space between the crosshairs and the target, he told fellow crew members during a briefing session. Your brain is screaming that you're dropping too early. But if you wait until it feels right, you're actually releasing too late, and the bombs will overshoot by half a mile. The mental discipline required to act against trained instincts proved challenging for bombardiers accustomed to following Norden indicators with mechanical precision. Combat conditions amplified the difficulty. German flak and fighter attacks during bombing runs created stress environments where reverting to practiced procedures represented natural psychological response. Forcing crews to consciously calculate and apply trajectory offsets while under fire demanded concentration levels that exhausted even experienced personnel. The first operational missions using offset bombing procedures departed English bases on December 22, 1943. 3 bomb groups, totaling 108 B-17 seconds, targeted German ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt that had survived previous attacks with minimal damage. Intelligence analysts had identified 12 critical production buildings whose destruction would reduce German ball-bearing output by 40%. Previous missions against Schweinfurt had achieved average hit rates of 3.8%, requiring massive formations and accepting extraordinary losses to achieve marginal production disruption. Major Donovan flew with the lead group, his role now expanded from bombardier to aerial tactics instructor, observing how combat crews implemented new procedures under actual battle conditions. The formation crossed into German airspace at 25,000 feet, their contrails marking white lines across frozen December sky. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire with mechanical regularity, filling the air with black bursts that rocked the heavy bombers like boats in storm swells. Donovan hunched over his bomb site, watching Schweinfurt materialize through scattered clouds. His hands made microscopic adjustments to compensate for wind drift and ground speed variations. The ball-bearing plant sprawled across the industrial district, its reinforced concrete workshops clearly visible in the Norden's magnified optics. 4 minutes to target. The bomb bay doors opened throughout the formation, exposing ordnance racks loaded with over 500 tons of high explosive. German fighters tore into the bomber stream, their cannon fire leaving smoke trails through frozen air. A B-17 from the low squadron exploded in an orange fireball, its wreckage tumbling earthward while parachutes blossomed like white flowers against dark ground. Donovan ignored the chaos and focused on trajectory calculations. Altitude 25,200 feet. Airspeed 198 miles per hour. Wind drift 14 miles per hour from the northwest. His slide rule showed required offset of 7,900 feet before the target center. The ball-bearing plant crawled toward his crosshairs. 2 minutes to release point. More fighters attacked from head-on, their cannon shells walking through the formation with mechanical precision. Another B-17 fell away, trailing smoke from destroyed engines. The surviving bombers maintained formation integrity, their tight spacing providing mutual defensive fire that kept German fighters at respectful distances. 1 minute, Donovan's hands steadied on the bomb controls. The target approached but remained ahead of Norden's release indicators. Every instinct demanded waiting until the crosshairs centered on factory buildings, but his calculations insisted that waiting meant bombs overshooting by thousands of feet. 30 seconds. His thumb hovered over the release trigger. The factory buildings remained visibly distant from the Fernie crosshairs. The Norden's mechanical computations indicated he should wait another 15 seconds for proper alignment. But physics demanded release now, while the target appeared unreached. Bombs away. Over 1,200 500-pound bombs tumbled from the formation, their fins stabilizing as they accelerated through freezing air toward the ball-bearing plant below. The formation turned for home through continuing flak and fighter attacks. 5 more B-17 seconds went down during the withdrawal, their crews bailing out over German territory or riding their crippled aircraft into spiraling dives that ended in countryside explosions. Total losses for the mission reached 14 bombers, 140 aircrew dead or captured. Cost measured in blood and aluminum remained unchanged from previous operations, but results would tell a different story. The reconnaissance photographs arrived 36 hours later, processed by intelligence analysts who'd learned to expect disappointing results from strategic bombing missions. They spread the Schweinfurt imagery across analysis tables, expecting familiar patterns of scattered craters surrounding intact factories. What they saw instead rewrote every assumption about bombing effectiveness. 473 bombs had impacted within the ball-bearing factory perimeter. 118 achieved direct hits on critical production buildings. The bombing pattern showed concentration that looked like precision artillery rather than high-altitude bombardment. Every targeted workshop had sustained significant structural damage. The factory's estimated production capacity had been reduced by 84% in a single mission, hit rate calculated at 87.6%. Intelligence analysts checked their calculations 3 times before submitting results to 8th Air Force headquarters. The numbers contradicted 2 years of operational experience so dramatically that senior officers initially suspected reconnaissance errors or photographic misidentification. Colonel Harrison brought the assessment to LeMay's office with an expression that suggested he'd witnessed something that challenged fundamental understanding. "General, the Schweinfurt mission results indicate hit rates that exceed anything we've achieved in 20 months of operations," he reported, spreading reconnaissance photographs across LeMay's desk. "If these numbers are accurate, offset bombing represents the most significant tactical advancement since we began the strategic bombing campaign." LeMay studied the images with the methodical attention of someone who'd learned to distrust initial assessments that seemed too good to be true. But the bomb craters clustered around target centers with patterns that couldn't be explained by photographic tricks or reconnaissance errors. The buildings identified as critical by pre-mission intelligence showed structural damage consistent with direct hits by 500-pound general-purpose bombs. "Get me mission efficiency calculations compared to previous Schweinfurt operations," LeMay directed. The mathematics would reveal whether the improvement represented marginal enhancement or fundamental breakthrough. Harrison returned 30 minutes later with comparative analyses that quantified the transformation. Previous missions against these targets required 4 bomb group operations, totaling 900 aircraft to achieve equivalent damage. "Sir," he reported, "acceptable losses ran approximately 60 to 70 bombers per mission cycle. We accomplished the same destruction with 108 aircraft and 14 losses. The efficiency ratio was almost inconceivable. Offset bombing had achieved in one mission what previous doctrine required 4 full-scale operations to accomplish. The reduction in aircraft and crew losses provided strategic advantages that extended beyond simple bombing accuracy into fundamental calculations about sustainable operations tempo and acceptable casualty rates. This changes everything." LeMay observed quietly, his voice carrying recognition that institutional knowledge had just been overturned by evidence that demanded complete doctrinal reconstruction. If we can maintain these hit rates across all target categories, we can destroy German war production in half the time using a third of the resources. The implications reached far beyond tactical improvements into strategic calculations about how America would employ its industrial and human resources to win the war. More efficient bombing meant shorter campaigns, fewer casualties, and faster advancement toward victory. It also meant that 2 years of previous operations had been conducted using methods that achieved marginal results while accepting extraordinary costs. The institutional lesson suggested that military doctrine could be fundamentally wrong about basic operational procedures, despite extensive training programs and sophisticated technological systems. Speed of doctrinal change became critical, as mission planners recognized that every day spent using old bombing methods meant continued inefficiency and unnecessary casualties. LeMay directed immediate implementation of offset bombing across all 8th Air Force bombardment groups. Training programs expanded to cover every lead bombardier, with standardized procedures that ensured consistent application of trajectory offset calculations. The transformation occurred with remarkable speed, driven by results that couldn't be dismissed by institutional resistance. Bombardiers, who'd initially expressed skepticism about deliberately ignoring Norden indicators, became vocal advocates after their first missions using offset methods. The photographs showing concentrated bomb patterns around targets provided evidence that overwhelmed theoretical debates about mechanical instrument accuracy. By January 1944, offset bombing had become standard operating procedure throughout the 8th Air Force. Mission planning calculations incorporated the new hit rate expectations, allowing strategic targeting to shift from overwhelming force against individual objectives toward broader campaigns against multiple industrial sectors simultaneously. The improved efficiency meant that bomber formations could strike more targets using fewer aircraft, accelerating the pace of operations against German war production. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.